Hello everybody, this is International Master Jesse Kraai, and today I'd like to share a bishop endgame that Valery Salov played against Khalifman in 1994 in their candidates match for the World Championship. That was then the FIDE World Championship match at that point, and they were still doing matches then, and Salov won this match against Khalifman and then went on to play against Kamsky and lost, and then Kamsky then lost to Karpov. And what's kind of interesting about all those matchups is they were all really endgame masters that you had in the 94 FIDE World Championship, with Salov definitely being one of them. And Salov is somebody you don't hear about too much today, but I think he was one of the, really in the 90s, one of the best players. And really, that was largely due to his endgame skill, and this is really a demonstration of that in today's game. Okay, so let's look at this position. Black's may be a tiny bit better here, simply because his bishop's on the dark and his pawn's on the light, whereas White's bishop is really restrained by his own pawn, so he has less mobility. But that really doesn't mean that, you know, White's in any serious danger here. But in the hands of someone like Salov, we'll see that he's able to create problems for his opponent. So let's take a look at how this goes. Okay, so Khalifman took, and he decided to trade off everything into the bishop endgame. Now, in a way, this was a funny decision from White, simply because the only problem in White's position was his bishop. And the only good thing about Black's position really was that his bishop was strong. But I think Khalifman judged, and this was actually correct still at this point, that he could draw this position without too much difficulty. Let's take a look at how Salov plays here. H5. Now, one thing I'm sure is that I'm pretty sure Khalifman probably offered a draw at some point during these exchanges. And what's nice about this game, I think, is it's a good example of playing on in what is probably a drawn position, but it's a position where Black can be creative if White makes a mistake. And White begins here really with the next couple moves kind of oblivious to the danger that he might face. His first move is natural, but it's kind of mistaken. And we'll see a little bit later what the danger is that he should be aware of. Black plays the king out, and White comes out as well. And both of these king moves, Black is really oblivious to, or White is oblivious to the dangers that are in store for him. And really it's here where Salov unleashes a bit of a cold shower upon White. And what he does is he plays b4. Now, first off, I have a feeling that Khalifman wasn't really anticipating this move, because it seems it's a little bit counterintuitive for Black to put his pawn on a black square where White will be able to attack it and where it will block his own bishop. So I think for that psychological reason, Khalifman didn't see this move coming. And the basic idea of this move is that now, after b4, if I can put my bishop on f4, I can completely trap this bishop's mobility, and it'll essentially be dead over there on the queen side, and we'll be almost, so it'll be as if we're up a piece. So, if we go back a step, any of these moves, h3, king f1, king e2, all White really had to play to get out of danger was bishop c3, and there would be really no danger at all for White. The bishop could come back to d2, the king holds the position, there's no way for Black to make progress. So, king g6, king e2, and now b4. And we'll see in a lot of these variations that this was really a perfectly timed trap. If the king was necessary to be out here in order for it to really work. Okay, well, let's take a look at some of the things that might happen here. In the game, Khalifman played g3, and that's definitely, I think, the right move. So you're trying to stop the bishop from coming to f4 to complete the trap on the bishop on a1. So let's just take a look, though. Say bishop b2 and bishop f4, white can try to play g3 and f4, but h4 is going to be too strong. For example, king f3 takes, and white either has to give us the pawn or allow us entrance into the white camp. Okay, so Hollyfman played g3, and already we can see that the position's gone from it seemingly completely innocuous for black to now a very dangerous position for white, and white's going to have to be careful. It turns out, however, that white can white can definitely still draw this. Let's look at how play progresses. King f5, and now bishop b2. And black continues with g5. And it's here that white makes the final mistake. And it's not an easy position here for white. Let's look at a couple of variations. Let's say king f3. And here we have a nice variation. For example, g4 takes. Now bishop f8. And so f4. White might believe that he's surviving here simply because he's traded off so many pawns. But let's take a look if he can actually survive. Bishop h6, g4, king g6, king g3, f5, king f3, takes, now bishop g5. And doesn't really matter that there's so few pawns on the board. It's simply the case that the bishop on b2 is trapped. So this is lost. For example, bishop a1, white's in zugzwang, has to do something. Bishop c1. Now white has to move the king. And it looks bad. And black will win with bishop d4. Okay, so let's go back. So king f3 doesn't work. And I think the only other alternative, which is the move that would have drawn, is king d3. So let's take a look at some of these variations and try to imagine which ghosts Hollyfman saw. For one, black could continue with g4, but that would really be the point of king d3, because now we can play h4. But maybe he feared something like king g6, and now bishop c1, f5, and we're threatening to play f4. Really, that's our only shot. It doesn't matter if we lose the pawn. If we can double the pawns and get our king to f5, black will be winning. But unfortunately for black here, white could just play bishop f4. And there's really no way to make progress now. There'll be no way for the black king to penetrate. So g4 doesn't work. So maybe he was afraid of h4. This is also interesting. It's a little bit counterintuitive to play h4 because you're putting the pawns in the black squares. But we'll see it's actually quite dangerous. g4, king f4, and look at this variation. King g2 takes. And there's no way for white to hold this either. For example, bishop d2, king f3, bishop e1, f5. And again, white's going to find himself in zugzwang. So, I guess that would have been the question. It looked like maybe Hollyfman thought that h4 was winning. Let's look if he takes the pawn. And here also we have an instructive variation. Bishop f4. So it's a nice variation. It's showing that the domination of the bishop is worth more than a pawn. And now if, say, h5, we'll just play g4. We'll win this guy, and then we'll come back to collect everything on the whole board, because the bishop will be trapped. So maybe white could try also hg, but this is also a cute variation. Let's say king takes, king f3, we'll go back, And it looks like white's holding, but it's not so simple. f5, king g2, f4. And now white's in zugzwang. If he puts the king here, we play f3. And if he puts the bishop on a1, like we've seen before, then we have bishop c1. So, king f3 would be the only option. And now king h3, king e2, and now we have a really nice move, king g2. And this is a very nice demonstration of how bad this bishop is, where this endgame is still winning for black. For example, bishop c1, f3, king d3, king g2, b3, f2, and this is winning. We'll win the pawns, for example. And white will have to leave his pawn on d4. So I think these were some of the ghosts that Halifman saw against playing king d3. And in the game, he ended up playing bishop c1, which we'll look at. But in fact, there's a little trick here that he missed. After h4 doesn't work because of g4, and now if king f4, we don't play bishop c1, we play king e2. And this is really a cold shower because now all of a sudden it's white who's winning. For example, f5, bishop c1, bishop e3, and there's no way to stop the mating net with f3 next move. Another variation could be king e4, f3 check, king f4, king f2. And again, there's no stopping the mate on c1. So this backwards move, these are always the hardest moves to find, king e2, was probably something that Halifman missed. As it was in the game, maybe I think, he probably thought the bishop c1, the move he played, was drawing as well. But we'll see that Salov has some ideas against bishop c1. First he plays g4. Okay, so now h4 isn't going to work because we have king e4. And it's too powerful. For example, bishop e3, and now we can play f5, and we're going to play f4, and white's in zugzwang anyway, so we're going to penetrate the next move with the king. So, Halifman has to take. He takes with the king. And maybe this was the point that he didn't understand when he played bishop c1. Because see, now after bishop d2, black has a very simple plan of playing f5, then f4, and having an outside pass pawn. And it turns out this outside pass pawn is enough to win in this position. In a way, it's like black has two advantages. He has a more active king, and he has now this potential of the active passed h-pawn. And usually two advantages like that will lead to a winning situation. White played bishop e1, intending to play f3, after we play f4. And Salov did the old Russian trick here, and that is, you play a waiting move when they can't do anything else about it, bishop e7. And white essentially has to go back to d2. If, for example, f3, we can play king h3, threatening king g2, and if king f2, we'll just play h4. And all of these pawn endgames, if the bishops come off, are going to be won for black, for example. And white is in zugzwang. He'll lose all of his pawns. The waiting move is a very nice psychological trick, because imagine you've already been sitting at the board for so long, and you give the opponent the appearance that you can't make progress just for one move. And then after, when he plays back, and you play back, and he plays back, then you go for it. It also gives you some time to think about things. So if white just takes, he's going to have the situation where the king will be active. We have the passed h-pawn, which will be a winning situation. So he plays f3, king h3, pawn takes, forced. And now a very nice move, king g2. Pawns aren't important to Salov. What's important is his passed pawn. F5 was played, bishop e7. So we stop the advance of the pawn, and we help promote our own pawn to h4. White now plays f6 to bring the bishop off the b4 pawn. Takes, h4. The bishop has to come back to try to guard. h3. I love this endgame. Black, I'm sure, could have taken this pawn as well, but that's not what is important. Now b4. How else is white going to make progress? And now another nice move, bishop e7. The bishop will be forced away from the defense of the b4 pawn, and then later we can swing the bishop back, and there'll be no way to stop the advance of this pawn. So, I thought this was a very instructive endgame for a couple reasons. For one, Salov is playing a world-class player in Halifman, and he doesn't take the draw in this slightly better position, which, yes, it was objectively drawn, but it's still the kind of position where there's everything still to play for. And I think a lot of us are guilty of not playing on in positions like that just because we assume that it has to be a theoretical draw. And our assumption would be right. It's just that maybe chess is a theoretical draw from the very beginning of the game as well, right? On the first move, that might also be a draw, but we still play on. So, this is International Master Jesse Kraai, hoping you've enjoyed this lecture. If you'd like to see another lecture on bishops of the same color, I did a lecture entitled An Instructive Bishop Endgame, which also has some nice themes in it. Bye-bye.